So you've got an Indian problem, and government is going to come up with some solutions to assimilate Native Americans into our society. And one of them is called the Dawes Act. And by all accounts, Senator Dawes had good intentions, and this was his plan. Separate the Indian from their tribal customs and people, their communal way of living, and make them more like Americans. Force cultural conformity. So how do you do that? You make them landowners. So basically the whole idea about the Dawes Act is to separate the Indians and make them more American. So it's very similar to the Homestead Act. You're going to give 40 square acres, 160 acres to a head of a family. Single people over 18 would get 80 acres, and if you're under 18, 40 acres. The land is yours, but it's going to be held in trust by the government for 25 years. After 25 years, it is theirs, and they become American citizens. So they had 4 years to select the land that they wanted. Afterwards, the Department of Interior would allocate the land to these individual families. So what's the result of all this? Not too good. Basically, let's eliminate communal ownership property, and off they went, and they were not used to this. This was foreign to their way of life, and many of the Native Americans that were participating in this end up selling their land to the railroad companies, to white settlers, and to corporations that were in the mining business. So this is an actual poster, and it's the allocated Indian land being sold off to others as they're going back actually to their tribal lands. The whole concept of individual land ownership, just it didn't compute. One of the quotes was, "Who owns the air we breathe? Who owns the clouds in the sky?" Again, the government's reasoning was to break up these tribal ties, to assimilate Indians into the American way of life. So out of 138 million acres allocated, Indians were basically cheated out of all but 52 million acres. So know what assimilation means. We're going to talk about assimilation when we get to immigration in this same historical time period 6. And basically to absorb a group into the culture of a larger group. We still talk about assimilation today. That was one of the big deals with Donald Trump when he was running, is the English as a second language issue. Should people that come into our country learn English right away? What should be the expectation of people coming into the country? Should they become Americans? Should they keep their own culture? So one of the other programs to assimilate was called the Carlisle Indian Schools, and their slogan was "Kill the Indian to save the man." So the first of these was in an old military base in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and 24 more schools would open across the country. Concept is that Indian children will be taken from their families, some as young as 9, 10, 11 years old. When they get there, they're going to be forced to speak English, wear American clothing, and they're going to cut their hair, and to act right, to teach U.S. values and culture. They're also going to teach trades, and so the idea is when they finish with this school, they'll go off into the world and leave their Indian ways behind them. So this is an example of one young man who comes in. This is as he arrives at Carlisle, and then this is after he is in the process of being assimilated. These are the schools. You can see the first one over here, 25. That is the first Carlisle Indian School. And then they're going to kind of spread out across the United States, even as far as Washington State, several in California, of course, some around where the Indian reservations are. But they actually wanted to separate them from their families, encourage no communication. They didn't go back on holidays and so forth. One of the athletes actually that came out of the Carlisle Indian School is a guy named Jim Thorpe, who is going to go on and become a professional football player. They're going to have a band, and it's hyped up to be this great thing to do for Native Americans. This is the original Carlisle Indian School, one of the dormitories. And please watch this. This is arriving at Carlisle, and it's about just 10 minutes long, and it just shows kind of the experience of one young man as he arrived. Sitting Bull, this is a famous quote, "If the Great Spirit had desired me to be a white man, he would have made me one in the first place." Gotta love Sitting Bull. This is a group that arrived at Carlisle. And this is that same group after their hair has been cut and they had been dressed as Americans. So another quote by Sitting Bull, "Whatever you have wanted of me, I have obeyed." Not quite true, Sitting Bull. He's going to be killed right before the Battle of Wounded Knee, sadly by somebody who had been deputized, one of his own people. So let's talk about a few of the presidents during this time period. Okay, we've got President Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican. You can pause and read through, maybe make some notes on some of the facts about Grant. One that people like to do is he's smoking those 20 cigars a day. Rutherford B Hayes, I'm going to be talking more about him when we get to the election of 1877, which was referenced several times in this last election because of fraud. So he was nicknamed his fraudulency, and because of Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida throwing their electoral votes his way, he ends Reconstruction, and he will be a one-term president. James A. Garfield, known as the Teacher, he is going to be assassinated shortly into his presidency and sadly takes 80 days to die. Alexander Graham Bell helped out a little bit by prodding in there looking for a bullet with a metal detector. So he's going to have a rather horrible death of infection. Chester Arthur will take over. His nickname was Elegant Arthur, and he was very conservative, where Garfield was considered a mugwump, wanting change. He was not a really good president, Chester Arthur. He had Bright's disease, didn't have a lot of energy, and was known to be kind of a dandy, had 80 pairs of pants. So some of the facts usually is 80 days to die for Garfield, 80 pairs of pants for Arthur. The Transcontinental Railroad. This is going to change America. The Union Pacific from Omaha, Nebraska to Promontory Point, and the Central Pacific from Sacramento, California to Promontory Point. So the Union Pacific, starting from Omaha, Nebraska, going to Promontory Point, Utah. Most of the people that worked on that were ex-Union, ex-Civil War soldiers, and formerly enslaved people, as well as Irish immigrants. The folks that got paid the least were the black workers and the Irish immigrants. The Central Pacific, coming in from Sacramento to Promontory Point, was mostly Chinese immigrants with some Civil War vets as well. So you can see the route here. They had a few rail lines, a railroad line that had already gone to Omaha. So now we're going to start in Omaha, right on the Iowa border, going to Promontory Point, and then the Central Pacific going from Sacramento to Promontory Point. So later, all of these other lines that you see will be added to this transcontinental railroad. Lots of difficulties. There are no, modern pieces of equipment, steam shovels, so forth. So everything was done by hand, going through the mountains, especially the Central Pacific, going through the mountains with the Chinese workers. They had used dynamite to go through these different passes, and in some cases absolutely through the mountain itself. Shovels, sledgehammers, pickaxes. The weather was at different times too hot, too cold, too wet, and too dry. So lots of difficulties building the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is the famous picture of East meeting West. You can see a big group. They had senators, governors, territorial governors. This was a very, very big deal. Okay, there's your map again, and now you can get clear from San Francisco to New York City via rail. This is going to have vast, vast economic consequences, health consequences. Shortly after this, the refrigerated car is going to be invented, and so just health-wise, for people being able to ship fruits and vegetables and crops, and then of course beef and so forth, grain, lumber, and then the coal mining, the steel mining. I mean, just this is going to have huge economic consequences for the United States. So when we're talking about settling the West, this is the order that the people came in. First, the miners, single men, just minimal equipment needed. Cattlemen, again, single men, for the most part, many enslaved, formerly enslaved young men and Mexicans. And then third, the families, the farmers are going to be coming in. So this is the order they came in: the miners, the cattlemen, and the farmers. The miners are coming in after gold, especially gold strikes in California, 1848. That led to the rush. 10 years later in Pikes Peak, there's a huge gold strike, bringing 100,000 miners to Colorado. Comstock lode was silver. That's on bringing them to Nevada. So in these various states, South Dakota, they're going to find gold. The gold mines in Arizona as well. So they're first going to come in with their pans and be panning for gold, and then pickaxe looking for that vein of gold. And then ultimately corporations are going to be doing the deep shaft mining. We're going to see that in Colorado especially, going very deep and looking for those big veins of gold. Towns will be built around these discoveries. They're called boom towns, and you'll see lots of, that's where the cowboy movies come in, you guys, with the saloons and the dance hall girls and so forth. Because lawmen were in short supply, there was something called vigilante justice. And that's basically enforcing the law without any legal authority. You steal a man's horse, and vigilante justice, that they will execute you, they will hang you. Stealing cattle, so forth. In the 1860s, were 5 million wild longhorn cattle in Texas, and people had developed a taste for beef, especially during the Civil War. You can feed a lot of soldiers with a cow versus a pig or a chicken. So the demand for beef is going to grow, and the first stockyards are opened in Abilene, Kansas with the railroads. And it was imperative to sell the beef to get that up there, and this is going to result in cattle drives. And these drives are going to last about 30 years, and people are going to develop this taste for hamburger and steaks, and basically we are a beef-eating nation. So most cowboys were light in weight. If you're on a horse all day long, they didn't want big, heavy cattlemen. And about 30,000 of these cowboys are going to be working during this 30-year period. The Chisholm Trail, which was from about San Antonio, Texas, all the way up to Kansas City, Abilene, Kansas, to the railroads, was the longest trail, and other trails would join in with them. The open range, anybody could use it. The cattle would graze. They didn't want them to move too fast. They wanted to bring them up there in good health with good. So what did they eat? The second highest paid guy on a cattle drive was the cook. And he would get up early in the morning, cook biscuits and coffee. And guys would put a couple of biscuits in their pocket to eat throughout the day. And then in the evening, he would have gone ahead and he would have prepared the evening meal. And mostly that was beans. I'm going to include a movie clip for you to look at that talks about these beans. Okay, what's going to end these cattle drives? Well, as the Homestead Act opens up all this land, farmers are moving into what was once the open range, and they are putting up something called barbed wire, a brand new invention by a guy named Joseph Glidden. It was cheap. You could just put a stick in the ground and wind this barbed wire around it. And now the cattlemen were forced to either fight the farmers, cut it down, or go around it. And then the straw was a crazy cold winter, 87 to 88. What we had last week, multiply that times 30 days. So whether the temperature, they said, in Texas, even as far as Shreveport, Louisiana, didn't even reach zero for days and days and days at a time, and cattle virtually froze in the fields. Remember, the absolute most important factor in the settlement of the West was the railroads. So our third group are the Homesteaders. So between 1870 and 1900, about 500,000 families are going to take advantage of the Homestead Act. 2.5 million are going to purchase land from railroad companies. So you're looking at about 300 million families coming into the western areas of the United States. They are going to encounter lots and lots of problems. Lots of that land, especially when you get into West Texas, western part of Oklahoma, you don't see any tall trees. So they would virtually cut squares in the ground and build their houses, a frame, and put this sod on the houses, and they were called sod busters. Then, during one crop period, starting in the Mideast, this huge plague of grasshoppers started moving across the country. They would virtually eat everything in sight. They said the cloud was so big that it would block out the sun, and it was kind of like a tornado. It would land, they would eat everything in sight, get into the wells, and then the farmers didn't have water, and then they would rise up and they might miss a farm or two and then land again. And by the time they get to Salt Lake City, Utah, the Mormons there are praying for a miracle, and a miracle happens. All of a sudden they look up and all these seagulls are coming from across the mountains, and they are going to devour the grasshoppers and save the Mormons in Salt Lake City. And they have a big statue actually outside the Mormon Tabernacle honoring these seagulls that saved them. Water scarcity, loneliness. 2/3 of the folks that move out west for a new way of life are going to fail. And those that do make it, they're going to get new farming techniques and new crops. There's a Russian wheat that's going to save many. It's very hardy and doesn't need a whole lot of water to grow. Another group of people that are going to settle are called the Exodusters from Exodus. And basically they are coming from the South, and these are formerly enslaved people that are looking for a new way of life, escape racism and that sharecropping system in the South. So mostly to the Midwest, mostly Kansas, and about 15,000 of these folks are going to be in this area by 1869. So this is an example of a sod home. I can't even imagine living in those conditions. Another sod home, you can see stuff actually growing on the roof here. So this guy, by the time 1890 comes, the West has been settled from coast to coast, and he says that the American spirit will collapse, that our whole way of life has been built on this idea of new frontiers and individualism. And he said we are doomed now to